Welcome to Sew with Mrs. Herbert. In episode 3, we'll learn sewing safety, the sewing machine parts, how to wind the bobbin, how to thread the machine. We'll learn about the measurements on the throat plate, and then do some practice stitching. So to begin, this is a picture actually from a worksheet that I used in my classroom many years ago. The To Sew Company made a number of wonderful resources for teachers for the classroom, and this was one of them. So in this picture, let's talk about sewing safety. First, we see a number of things that you should not do. So let's start and work one way. We've got this little girl handing a pair of scissors. You know that when we hand scissors, we hold the blade in our hand and hand them the handle. The girl has her leg up. That's not appropriate or safe. Have both legs down. And what about this table? You should be sewing on a sturdy table. So obviously this leg needs to be locked. What about our iron? When you iron, when you want to test the heat, you should never, never, never touch a hot iron. But you can take your iron and just touch the ironing board. Now put your hand on that. The transfer of heat will let you know that it's hot enough. And obviously when you're finished ironing, you never leave it laying down. You need to put it in the holder or have it standing up. Now following that, this cord is underneath the ironing board, which of course is not safe. And it leads over, and it's a lot of cords in the way where we could trip on them. So keep your cords a safe distance to the wall, not around your feet. Now notice we've got our pattern guide sheet directions on the floor. We're going to trip on them. We've got other things, a needle, thread that we could trip on. So keep the floor clean. Now notice as we see this pin cushion on the floor and infants, toddlers nearby, pick up your pins right away. If you have pets also, pick up your pins right away. Now, as I look up, I see this boy first with pins in his mouth. We never, ever, ever put pins in our mouth. Also, he has his hands placed so that his fingers are too close to the needle, and obviously he's not watching what he's doing. I had a little girl want to learn to sew. The TV was on in her home, and she kept looking up. And so we need to turn off the TV so she wasn't distracted. She needed to be paying attention to where she was sewing. So our hand placement is important, and always watching where we're sewing. Now one more thing. If our girl had hair long enough, she's leaning forward. Her hair isn't that long here, but some people with very long hair, they could get their hair caught up within the uptake lever. And we don't want that to happen because your hair is as fine as thread. So you need to keep your hair back if it's very long. Anything I missed? Anything else you can think of? I'd like to introduce you to January Schaefer, owner of Cherry Berry Quilt Shop in Calamasa, California. She is going to show you some beginner level sewing machines.
Come my way. Now I'm going to show you the Joy made by Baby Lock. A few of the features that it has your width, your length, your width. You have your bobbin winder. It also has arrows showing you how to thread the machine. I don't know if you can see that on here or not. It also shows you how to set up the bobbin winder. It also has a little needle threader here and your reverse button. Pretty basic, very simple machine, which is great to have when you're just beginning. Now I'm going to show you the Brother Novus, the NS80E. On here, you can adjust your stitches by just a turn of the dial. You have your stitch length, you have your stitch width. You can also use a double needle on it. You have your reverse button on this one here. If you engage this, when you start to sew, we'll do a reverse in the beginning when you start sewing. You also have speed control right here. You have your needle up, needle down. You have a reinforcement knot. You can do reverse with this button here. You can sew with or without your foot pedal. You also have a nice needle threader right here, and you have a lot of these beautiful stitches. Now we have the Burnett B37. This machine here, you can adjust your stitch length and your stitch width digitally. You also have an area where it shows you what foot you need to use when you're getting ready to use a certain stitch. You have your speed control on this one, needle up, needle down, your button that you push to lock in your stitches. You have your reverse button here, and you can sew with or without your foot pedal. This also has your needle threader down here, mechanical one, and it also shows you how to thread the machine by following the arrows. And that's it.
January showed us 3 sewing machines that were beginner level machines. Now, all machines, no matter what level, have the number of basic parts with very similar names. So let's take a look. We have bobbin winder. It says stopper and spindle. So on your machine, this is the stopper. Here's the spindle. This is where you place the metal or plastic bobbin on to wind it. This is a spool pin. It might be vertical or horizontal. Right here, we have a bobbin winder thread guide. Thread will go from the spool around there over to the bobbin. Now, right here, this part is called the thread take-up lever. What happens when you're actually sewing is that this actually travels up and down. So that's why we call it the take-up lever. It pulls the thread up. Now, you can't see it in this picture, but the presser foot, the handle for it or lever to pull it up, is actually right behind. If you can go straight through, it's right behind this part. On some machines, you access it from this side. Sometimes you go from inside here to reach it. This was a thread cutter. Let's go down here. The needle or throat plate. Most of the machines, when I was growing up, we called it the throat plate, but some have switched to calling it the needle plate. Either one. This is square on this machine. Sometimes they're narrower and more rounded, but this is the throat plate. Now, there's a little plastic view-through window that you can see the bobbin case inside. So the bobbin case isn't labeled, but they all have a bobbin case. This machine has a drop-in bobbin. Some machines, you take this part off, and there's a front-loading bobbin. Drop-in bobbins are easier for beginners. I prefer this kind. Okay, if we go over here, thread tension dial. So this, we follow it up. This dial has some numbers on it, and you can either tighten or loosen the tension on the thread that's going through the machine. Now here you have your reverse lever. On this machine, it's right here, it's a rather large lever. As you hold it down, the machine will sew backwards. The minute you let go, it pops back up and you're sewing forward. And that's typical on most machines. No matter where this lever is, you need to hold it down in order to continue going in reverse. Now this machine has 3 dials. All machines have somewhere that will lengthen the stitch, widen it, and they all have a hand wheel. But first let's look here. The pattern selection dial. If it only sews straight, it wouldn't need this. But if you're going to sew straight, sew zigzag, you need something to be able to switch the mechanisms inside the machine. So here, these are dials. Sometimes it's a lever or something. On this one, stitch length. So there are numbers on it. You can turn it, have a shorter stitch or a longer stitch. The stitch width dial, a wider stitch or a narrower stitch. The hand wheel isn't shown, but it would be right over here on the side of the machine. So there we have it, the basic parts of a sewing machine. Now, if you were in my classroom, I would take all these names off and have you write down what they are. Show you this part of the machine enlarged. So here, it's much easier to see. You have the presser foot, and there are different presser for different functions of the machine. So this is the standard one. You have a machine needle. Again, there are different types for different weights of fabric. This is the clamp that you unscrew or tighten to change your needle. So these are very important parts to know: the needle clamp, the needle, the presser foot. Now these others, here's a screw that keeps this component on. This is something the presser foot snaps onto. And then back here, there's a little lever so that you can drop this presser foot off before you snap another one. So those are those miniature parts right inside. Let's thread this machine. I frequently stand up in order to get it through the first thread guide, but there's through number 1. Come down, follow to number 2. Now under number 2 are some tension discs. Those tensions keep the thread the proper tautness when it's sewing. So the presser foot has to be up. You may not be able to see it, but my presser foot is up when I put the thread underneath number 2. I bring it up. Here's number 3. Go around so that it slips into this little space. Pull it down. There's a guide right here. I'm going to put it sideways to slip it into that guide. And then I need to thread the needle. You thread the needle straight back on this machine. I have a needle threader. I push it down. I put the thread underneath that first little hook, underneath the second, and now when I let go with my left hand, push it a little bit, it popped up. The thread is now through the hole in the needle. I'll pull this loop through. Now, it's time to put the bobbin in. We take this little plastic cover off. Some older machines have a slide here. When we put the bobbin in, the bobbin thread should roll off counterclockwise, the opposite of the clock. So I drop it in. There's a little indentation that I put it through. There's an arrow that says go this way. So I pull it toward the left, then lay it down on a separate little opening. I put my cover back on. Now, we're not quite ready. We need this bobbin thread to come up through the throat plate or needle plate. So to do that, I take the thread that we just threaded through the needle and the thread through in the bobbin case, take my hand wheel, go to the top, turn it towards you, top down towards you, which is also counterclockwise, one complete time. Now I can pull the thread that's through the needle, and you'll see the loop. We just pulled up the thread from the bobbin case. And there, both of my threads are where they need to be. In order to sew, I'll put them both back through the slot in my presser foot. This is the throat plate on the sewing machine, sometimes called the needle plate. There are a number of lines that reflect the measurements that we need when we're sewing. I'm going to show you a picture of a throat plate and talk about those divisions. Here's a picture of a throat plate and then 1 inch of a ruler. A sewer needs to be very familiar with the inch divided into eighths. We have 1/8, 2/8, which is 1/4 of an inch, 3/8, 1/2 an inch, which is equivalent to 2/4 and 4/8, 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, and 1 inch. Now, a seam allowance for clothing is typically 5/8 of an inch, but we don't have a ruler holding up to our needle to show how wide it needs to be. That information is on the throat plate. So as I show you, if you look from the 3/8 here, this first line for the 4/8 or 1/2 an inch is the second line. 5/8 is the third line out. So when I'm going to sew, if I'm just a beginner, I might just put a piece of tape right here, right along this line. This won't be here, of course. And then I'll remember that that's 5/8, and I'll put my fabric underneath my needle and have it rest against that piece of tape. If I was making, again, here's 3/4 of an inch, 6/8, I could do the same thing, put a piece of tape as a guide, 7/8. So that helps you know, how wide do I make my seams? You're using the 1/8 of an inch on the guide of your throat plate. It's time to do some practice stitching. Before we ever put thread in the machine, we actually practice sewing straight. So here, I've enlarged, just so you could see, a plain piece of school paper, just lined paper. And we've got a red line here where the margin is. So I'm going to start sewing on the first line and put my needle in right in where the blue and the red intersect. I'm also going to draw a line right here. You can see on the back where that same margin would be on the back of the paper. It kind of shines through. I'm going to draw a line there so that I can practice sewing from here to here. Now I'm going to set that aside, and I have a real piece of paper. I've done a couple rows for you already. I started at the intersection and went to the line that I drew. We're going to practice sewing every other line on my paper. So first, I line it up so that my needle is going to go right at that intersection. And so because the feed pulls it back a little as I go, I need to readjust. Yep, I have the needle right where I want. Now, because it's easy to just put your foot on the gas and go, vroom, we need to learn control. That's why we're stopping at this line. So, when you sew, you don't have to push or pull. You just steer, you just guide your fabric. And so we're just pretending this is our fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and sew, and the space on my foot here, right in the middle, is where my needle will be sewing. So I put my line right down the middle, and the needle will go down on that line, and I will be making holes in the paper that represent stitches. So you notice I'm just going very slowly until you have more and more experience. You'll be able to go quicker, but I'm getting close to that line, so I'm going to do my last couple stitches by using my hand wheel. I'm going to start from the top and turn down, one stitch, and then one more, and that's exactly where I want it to be. Now, because I'm practicing sewing, I want my needle to be as high as it can be when I take my fabric out from underneath the presser foot. So I'm looking at my needle, have my hand on my hand wheel, and I'm turning my hand wheel so that needle to the highest portion or highest place. Now I can lift my presser foot. Now I'm used to going from this way for my presser foot. This machine, you go from the inside, pull it up, and now you can take your paper out. Now, again, I'm practicing the real thing, so when I have thread there, I usually put my fingers near where the thread is and then take it out. Let's do another one. I'm going to skip a line it up, put my needle down. Yep, it's right where I want to go. And I'm going to follow that line, the blue line on my paper. And I'm just steering, getting close to where I want to stop. There, one stitch done with the hand wheel, needle up as high as it can go. And now lift the presser foot, underneath here for this one, and then take it out. What you're going to do is you're going to sew every other line on this entire piece of paper. Once you feel like, I've mastered this, then if you were in my class, I would give you an assignment to turn in. Here's an example. Here it says paper stitching number 1. You can see right there. So I would have you start here and end here and sew all of these. And this is the one, when I look at it, to give you credit for doing this and following the lines, I'll just look on the back and see that all the lines are straight. So that's your practice stitching straight lines. Now, to practice stitch zigzag, we need to thread our machine first. Once you master sewing straight on paper, we're going to now learn how to use some of the dials. We're going to learn how to lengthen the stitch and how to widen the stitch. So this is a practice page for that. So it says straight, I'm going to move it over so you can see, straight stitching. Here, stitch length 1, stitch length 2, stitch length 4, and it's saying that that's specifically for gathering or basting. So let's start with that. So stitch length 1. I'll come over here to this length dial, turn it so that the 1 matches up with the line at the top. Doesn't say anything about width yet, so that's only change. So we're sewing a very, very, very short stitch. And so when I did that, I'm going to show you the stitch. I started here, I ended here. On the back, you can barely tell there's any little stitches. So that's the first one. Stitch length 2. I'm going to turn this dial to a 2 and repeat. Put it in, put the presser foot down, stitch across, stop right at the end, and then of course you notice I trim my threads. The last one, stitch length 4. I would turn it to the 4, put my paper in, put my presser foot down, sew across, go right to the end with the last few stitches with the hand wheel, pull it out, cut your threads. So that's pretty easy. You've already done a lot of straight stitching, but you just practice using this stitch length dial. Let's address the zigzag stitches. Here it says stitch length 1, stitch width medium. The next one has stitch length 2, medium width, stitch length 4, medium width. We're learning how to use the dials. So on this machine, in order to zigzag, I need to turn selection dial to C. The length is at 1, and it said medium. So my numbers here are from 1 to 5, so I'm going to put 3 as medium. I'll put my paper with the line lined up just like I did for straight stitching. Lower the presser foot, make sure my needle is exactly where I want it at the beginning. Adjust that, lift up the presser foot so it's right where I want. And now when I sew, the center line that I'm following is going down the middle of that presser foot. Looks like the needle is going to be exactly on that line, but the needle is going to go from side to side. So as I sew to the end, do it just like the others, get to the end, slow down with the hand wheel, and then bring it up. So we'll just pretend. We sewed all the way down. We're finished. We lift up the presser foot. Whoops. Make sure my needle's up. And now pull that out. All right. Continue then. The next one is stitch length 2 with medium. So I'm going to make the length 2. So when I sew that, you can see the spaces between the zigzags are a little wider apart. And then the last one, change the length to 4, and you get this really big wide zigzag. Once we've completed these zigzag stitches, we need to make sure to reset the dials. I'm going to do straight stitch again. So I'll turn my selector back to A. My length, I typically have a 2.5-inch stitch length. And the width is now disengaged because we're in the A selector portion. When I start stitching and I need to reverse first, I start in a little ways, anywhere from, I did it here, a 1/2 inch, but to just a 1/4 inch, just a small amount. And I start with reverse. So I go backwards right on the line I want to sew, just a couple stitches to the very beginning. Okay, let go of that reverse, and then I'll sew forward. Now this has been sewn. When you get to the end, push reverse and go backtrack. And so sometimes you hear it called back tacking, but you backtrack right on your previous stitching. So you should not be going back and forth. Just back a few stitches is all you need in order to backstitch. Now you have some work to do. May I call it homework? Take out the manual for your specific sewing machine and review it so that you're more comfortable with your machine. Wind 2 bobbins using the color thread that will match the pants you're making. Practice threading your machine. In my classroom, I would have you thread the machine in 1 minute or less. And then the measurements on the throat plate. Identify where 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, and so on, so you're comfortable with lining up your fabric to measure a certain seam allowance. And last, practice stitching on paper. It's so fun to follow a line of paper. Remember when you're finished that you're going to need to replace your needle to actually sew on fabric. So do your practicing before you change your needle. Now, in our next episode, we're going to learn about pattern symbols, learn how to read the pattern side sheet, find the cutting layout for our project. We're going to be pinning our pattern onto our fabric, and yes, we'll be cutting out our pants.